Thanks, Ian, and thanks to James and NSI for inviting ACBF. Let me quickly delve into my presentation. And as Ian mentioned, the African Capacity Building Foundation puts together the ACI, the Africa Capacity Indicators Report. And I'm going to be speaking on the third report. The initial report was in 2011 on state fragility. The second was on agricultural transformation and food security in 2012, and the 2013 report, which I'll be speaking to, was on capacity development for natural resource management. My outline basically is in 4 sections. So I'll talk a bit about the context of Africa today, then why the need to assess capacity, zoom in on the 2013 report, then discuss the new normative and policy environment, and then conclude. Now, if we look at Africa today, and I think this was highlighted in Ngozi's presentation, and then Jim also mentioned it, the continent seems to be moving at 2 speeds. On one hand, we're talking of high GDP, we're talking of high growth rates, we're talking of discoveries of natural resources on a daily basis. But at the same time, as the gentleman from DRC did mention, we see that there's poverty, there's unemployment, there's malnutrition. So one can argue that it's moving at two speeds, or multiple speeds, actually. Now, this then poses certain interesting questions in terms of what needs to be done. And I think from a capacity building standpoint, it's important then to understand how does one address some of these issues that are confronting the continent. So why the need for us to measure capacity? First and foremost, it's important from a planning standpoint, not only to plan, but to manage, to implement, to account for results, what is happening. Secondly, if one needs to effectively integrate capacity development objectives, one needs to basically be able to measure and understand what the landscape looks like. Again, if we're going to gauge achievement, you needed that measurement. But even more importantly, for one to understand the underlying factors that drive change, such that one then can understand and better map out as well as plan going forward. Now, in doing so, we look at capacity from 3 angles: the individual, the organizational, and the enabling environment. So our conceptualization is very similar to what UNDP does. But also, we look at capacity by asking capacity for what? Because I think this is critical if you're going to be able to really understand it and measure it. So, ACI 2013, which, as I did say, focuses on capacity for natural resource management. As I did mention, in 2011, and I'll just go back, 2011, basically, when we started out, we measured capacity in 34 countries. In 2012, we went up to 42 countries, and then in 2013, it was 44 countries. As you can see, all the brown countries were countries that were covered. The yellow countries were ones that we had wanted to cover, but we ended up only mapping out, adding Tunisia and Principe and Sao Tome. And I'm sure you all know that as a result of the Arab Spring, it would have been very difficult to go asking questions on capacity, state legitimacy. Hence, much of North Africa was not covered. We're hoping that going forward, we'll be able to do this. Now, in terms of the conceptualization, multiple stakeholders are involved, and then what we do is we combine different sources of data. So at the country level, we're working with country experts to collect data on the ground. Then we globally source the best expertise we can get for background papers. We work with different think tanks on the continent, 16 to be precise, as far as last year is concerned. And within the foundation itself, the Knowledge and Learning Unit then basically pulls this together. Now, given that the continent of Africa is moving at multiple speeds, the natural resource sector was very critical. Almost on a daily basis, we hear countries that have discovered natural resources. Actually, I think on the continent today, only about 2 or 3 island nations can be said not to have any resources. So with these resources being discovered almost on a daily basis, it was important to understand what is it and how do we manage these resources. Also, we do know that if resources are managed well, then it affects one's development strategy. On the other hand, if not managed well, we hear of the resource scarce, we hear of conflict, we hear of tension. Hence, the whole issue of capacity and the governance aspect was very critical. Now, if one were to look at the landscape, and I think this is what has come up part of this morning, we realize that historically, the discourse on natural resource governance on the continent has been characterized by one of conflict, one of tension, but also we hear stories of certain asymmetries that, okay, we have weak states dealing with strong external actors, mainly the multinationals and the countries that these multinationals represent. There's often a low or erratic commodity prices, unfair terms of trade. Countries have weak bargaining capacity, while poor systems of taxation and windfall rents, in many cases, when realized in the past, would go to a certain sector of the population, maybe the elites. All right. I think all these challenges and more led to a discrediting of the natural resource-based development as a viable sector for national well-being. However, based on our research, this landscape is changing. And it is changing for the better. Now, if one looks at the landscape today, what do we realize? There are a number of things that characterize the current landscape, and soon I'll sort of like go into the data itself. Increasingly, we're seeing a growing coherence and strong policy framework. I think when the Minister Ngozi highlighted what Nigeria is doing, one realizes that Nigeria, that historically had been a poster boy or poster child for some of the crises in natural resources, has totally transformed, and a lot is being done. And it's not only Nigeria alone. Also, we've witnessed that there's a high, even if one could argue that it's erratic, commodity prices. And I think this, we argue, that is going to be sustained, especially with the demand from the BRICS, primarily China and India. Increasingly across countries, we're seeing that a lot of effort is being put into technical skills and training, right? We also see a greater sophistication and a political will to bargain. There are a number of initiatives currently on the continent. EITI, Revenue Watch is doing an excellent job. They publish what you pay. So there are a number of interesting initiatives going on. Also, if you look at the civil society landscape, we see a strengthened civil society, often with external links, and these are helping to transform the landscape. So invariably, what one witnesses today is that there are new configurations of the dialogue taking place between the public, the multinational sector, civil society, and even the local communities. We discussed earlier on, I think there was a question on artisanal and small-scale mining. Increasingly, we see at different country levels that these stakeholders are being brought to the table, and efforts are being made to see how best to integrate them into the value chain. The exposure of the problem of missing revenues and the growth on the push for corporate social responsibility initiatives are also basically all being put forth. So if one looks at the old landscape and looks at it today, what we see is that as a result of all these efforts, increasingly there's a rejection of blood diamonds, and we see this with the Kimberley process. There's a totally push from conflict timber, and countries such as Liberia have done an excellent job at this. Mozambique has recently renegotiated and canceled a number of contracts because of abuses. Also, we see that there's a lot of self-policing within the multinational sector itself. So this combined with initiatives at the continental level, the African Peer Review Mechanism, the African Mining Vision, right, NEPAD's Capacity Development Strategic Framework, all these have led to a transformation within the sector in the positive direction. So, for example, let's look at the strategic use of natural resources for the needs of today in terms of public investment. Now, if you look at the 45 countries that were surveyed, and I say 45 because in the report we highlight 44. We covered South Sudan, but unfortunately the data came too late to include it in the report. So the report has 44, but I'll speak to 45. And so, yeah. Almost, 22 countries have solid frameworks for investing in this. Another 50 have it, and even it's put into a national development strategy, which is wonderful. That said, there's still work to be done because you can realize that there's another 27.5, almost 28, that do not have any such initiative in place. Right now, if also we go back to people like Collier, who argue that of the resources on the continent, roughly only 20% has been found, right? So there's an 80% that has yet to be mapped out or extracted. Then this becomes really critical. That's important that countries then put in place these frameworks. So even though a lot are being done, more needs to be done. Thanks. Now, if you look at the policy environment, you can just see from the green bars that a lot of countries, together, I'd say about 67% of all countries have excellent policy frameworks put in place. And I think we observed this also from Minister Ngozi's speech, where she talks about what Nigeria is doing. And again, Nigeria is not alone. Now, let's look at dialogue space. In many countries, civil society is now strengthened, and then they have the space to maneuver. Some of this might be attributable to not strong state, but it is a positive thing that they have the forum to be able to dialogue issues and move forward. In many countries, they've also been brought on board. We talked about the issue of training. Here again, we can see that a number of countries have invested in training. Now, what does this all mean? Now, if one were to look at it, you realize that within the clusters that we have, the policy environment is the strongest, where we have almost 84% of the countries in the very high sector. Now, the processes for implementation, it's okay, but we need work there. Now, as we move along, in terms of development results, it's not that wonderful. But when you come to actually capacity development outcomes, that is the weakest. And this is not strange. I mean, this is something that was observed and discussed in Busan. And the argument is that more needs to be done. But, I mean, for those of you who follow analysis and statistics, you'd realize that if one were to map out the S-curve, it tells us that if we move positively and continue to strengthen what is being done, we should get to a point where, in terms of capacity development outcomes, we'll move from a high right now where almost all countries are in the low to change this and bring countries into the green or very solid green. Now, so we're saying today there's a revised landscape. What contributed to it? This more complex landscape. And part of this has been what I've discussed. But what is even more important is how we got here. In terms of how we got here, it was the hard way. Countries just learned the hard way. The old revised system was not working, and there was a need for change. There was conflict, there was tension, there was a lot of policing. Now, things just needed to change, so we seem to move. From a country's perspective, and I'm just going to highlight a few here, if you look at Liberia, the forestry sector, they've transformed it tremendously under President Johnson Sirleaf. Mozambique has done similar. If you look at Nigeria's statutory backing for the ETI, the minister talked about their sovereign wealth fund. Nigeria is not alone. Angola has done similar. Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, so many countries are moving towards that positive step. Ethiopia has invested a lot in higher education, specifically for the sector. Sierra Leone's done almost similar. So today, we have this new environment within which there's a big transformation. The landscape has totally changed from one of negativity, one characterized by resource scarce, to one that is moving in a positive direction. That said, one could argue that agency is unrealized potential, and we do agree. But what needs to be done, and I think you will hear this, the minister mentioned this, there's a need to invest more in capacity, and capacity for all the stakeholders along the value chain. So it's not just national governments, it's not just civil society, the multinationals, the local NGOs, and even local communities, the artisanal and miners. All people along the continuum need to be strengthened. From our perspective, how should this be done? And we believe that you go from the policy environment through processes of implementation, development results, and then you achieve your outcomes. That if this is done, right, the whole value chain will be strengthened and we'll begin to see results across the board. So in conclusion, and I hope I'm still in time, we argue that if one looks at the state of capacity, it is good, but definitely more needs to be done. Capacity for all stakeholders need to be enhanced. There's a need for independent, accountable institutions. The legislature needs to be strengthened. Different sectors along the value chain need to be strengthened. Also, the political will to take these bold steps are critical. I think if all these are done, right, then these winds of change that we're observing will be sustained. Already the winds of change that are being observed, they're reflected in the statistics, but also they speak to the governance outcomes that are put out. They speak to the positive stories of governance that are coming out, and even the economic development stories that are coming out. And I think collectively, one can argue that we're moving from a landscape that was pretty gloomy, all right, to one that we can be proud of, that seems to be moving in the right direction, that reflects a positive will and reflects good things being done on the ground. Thank you so much.